Hello everyone, Alistair Gold here. It's that time of the week where we rattle through some of your questions. Got 22 of them today. There were other questions that were also put in, but unfortunately I only have this kind of a set time limit until my phone goes a little bit mad with these. I think it's around the 40-minute mark, so I know how much I waffle. So I'm going to try and restrict it to the 2022 mark, and then anything I didn't get round to, hopefully I'll do it on the next video for you. In quite a good mood today because I've just finally got to see some football, for some live football. Watch some Bundesliga, watch Dortmund absolutely smash a very weak Schalke team. They really weren't very good, and I flipped over to see the very end of the Leipzig match with its VAR controversy. Certainly haven't missed VAR controversy, but without going down too much into that kind of line of talk, it'll be interesting to see kind of what happens next with that. Obviously, it was great to see football. Weird to see it without crowds. It took them a little bit of time to get used to it, you could see, and I think so it will for the viewer as well. But obviously now it's what comes next and what happens if people, get the virus and how it's dealt with. But we remain to kind of watching on to see what happens, and then obviously how that impacts other leagues around Europe. But let's get straight on with your questions. Otherwise, I will talk about that for a long time. Jordan Gallagher asks, on a similar-ish vein, what clubs in the Premier League and Europe will actually be able to spend big money on players in the next transfer window? I think that's key, really. I don't think there's going to be many. I mean, we're already looking at the likes of Barcelona allegedly offering swap deals for players because the money is not there. And obviously that's one of the biggest clubs, Man United. Ed Woodward's come out and said that there's not going to be big deals. Somebody came out yesterday and it's completely slipped my mind. One of the big clubs said you're not going to, it might even be Bayern Munich, said that you are not going to see transfers, over around the €100 million mark. It's just not going to happen. So it's going to be very different. And I think there's also a slight morality side to it, where football's getting a bit of flack even for starting up again. And I think to then go out and splurge enormous, vast amounts of money on signing players is going to look pretty awful in the current climate as well. And I think there will be an element to that. Some clubs that maybe have used furlough schemes, or clubs that have asked their staff to take a wage cut and then they're going and spending big money. It doesn't sit right. I know it would have been a pre-done deal, but Norwich obviously used the furlough scheme, and then I think it was maybe around the same time, then announced the signing of a player for next season, albeit I think it was a free transfer, but still it just didn't sit right. And you can imagine what that would be like with an enormous transfer. So I can't really see many doing it. I think we're going to have quite a stable, I think I've said this before, quite stable squads going into the following season. And then maybe next year, in a year's time, you start to see it getting back to some kind of semblance of normality, other than, as I've said, those cheaper signings which we'll come to. Dean Cox asks, why aren't we seen as the club to buy, with the best stadium, world-class training facilities, one of the most successful managers in history, and a class team that can be improved with just a bit of financial backing? I think there are. I think the issue right now is I don't think, despite kind of speculation, I don't think ENIC want to sell the club. Levy said that at the last Tottenham Hotspur Supporters Trust meeting, which was, I think it was the edge of, was it just before the Leipzig game, about a week or so before. So that's, you're looking at 2 months or so ago, and he said there's no intention to sell the club. And I think that's the thing. I think, it's all there, as you say, the stadium, the training facilities, having Mourinho, this massive marketable manager now at the helm. But I just don't think they feel it's quite there yet. Maybe it's a case of, certainly not now. I think with the current financial issues that you're seeing in the world, I would imagine you're probably not going to accept any deal for the club right now, because it would have to be a lowered expectation one. But yeah, I don't think they're quite at that stage yet. I think there's more to do around the stadium, the complex. You still got the hotel, there's other elements to it as well. And I think maybe once that's done, it becomes a total package, and then a decision has to be made. But I just can't see it right now as being the time to sell a football club, or that football club anyway. Obviously, we see what's happening in Newcastle. El Comanchero asks, could Teemu Pookie replace Harry Kane should he move on, and how much should we pay for him? That's a tough one. Timo Pookie obviously had a brilliant start to the season, really, really good. Maybe didn't maintain it quite for the second half of the season. Dangerous player. Personally, and I remember reading this question, I know you're from Finland, so I don't want to insult the player in any way, because certainly he's a very good player and has proved that he's a Premier League player. I don't see him as a direct replacement for Harry Kane. I could see him as, certainly, if you could get him on a cheap deal, coming in as another option, someone to help him, but it doesn't feel to me like a player that would, and I hate to say this, adequately replace Harry Kane. We see the goals he scores in the Premier League, and I think Pookie is just a guy who's just now starting to kind of get used to Premier League life, and I can't see it myself being I think if Spurs were going to get the silly money, as I've said before, I don't think Harry Kane is going to move on in the next transfer window anyway. But I think if he was, you're looking at silly money someone would have to pay, which I previously said no one would. So if you were in the ideal world getting, it's not an ideal world, but in that kind of world getting that sort of money, I think they'd go for someone with a little bit more of a reputation and a price tag than Pookie. But certainly a really good, not sort of prospect, he's too old to be a prospect, but certainly a player that's proven he can do something in the Premier League. I'd just like to see him sustain it now for, if Norwich stay up for another season, or if Norwich go down and he moves to another Premier League club, just to show he can actually do it. Chad Mercer asks, do you think Willian will be a regular starter if he signs for Tottenham, and will he face a hostile fan base if he does? I would look at that team and I'd say he's not going to be an immediate regular starter. However, you've got to throw in the element that he's a player that Mourinho really likes, knows incredibly well, knows Mourinho's demands and what kind of he wants from his teams. So that kind of will put him ahead some other players. I just see so many names now in those attacking midfield slots. I think we're going to see a lot of fluidity, other than maybe Son, perhaps, and it depends obviously how Bergwijn kind of develops. Obviously, you've got Ali, and I mean, that's already three players. I was about to say it's going to be quite fluid, and you've got three players there that I think will be the three behind Kane, pretty much. So, yeah, I think that pretty much answers the question. I don't think he'll be a regular starter. I think he'll, at that age, would have to accept a role where he's kind of coming in and out of the team. But I don't think that's a bad thing for Tottenham, but it's whether that's what he wants. And I think there'll be a lot of competition for him. I think there's going to be a lot of clubs throwing wages at him because he's a free transfer, which is going to be a rarity, as in a talented free transfer as well. And on the hostile fan base, I don't think so. I think football clubs, as long as you come in and you do the business and you score goals, set up goals, whatever, I think we forget kind of what went before. I think, you even see that with managers. I think Mourinho, some people will hold his past against him being Chelsea manager, but if he wins trophies, I think he'll win people over. It's all about what you do out there. Robin asks, what's your opinion on Gedson Fernandes? What role do you see him taking in the future? And will Spurs pay the release clause for him, the fee to make his loan move permanent? I actually wrote about him only yesterday. Actually, I think it went online this morning. I think Gedson Fernandes is a real blank canvas for Mourinho. He's a player he knows incredibly well, young compatriot. He knows well aware what he's capable of, and also that he's a player who really hasn't found a position yet. He's only turned 21 a couple of days before Spurs signed him in January. He's a very young midfielder. And I think he hadn't even really fully established himself as a guaranteed starter at Benfica. He'd had a metatarsal injury this season, which didn't help, but I think he was still very much finding his feet. And I think a lot of that is a coach trying to work out where to play him. And kind of having looked at, obviously he's had, 2-3 starts, FA Cup, Champions League. He's definitely a box-to-box player. He's got a nice kind of box of tricks that he can kind of unveil during games, and he works incredibly hard. He's neat and tidy on the ball, I'd say. Obviously, we know he doesn't take the greatest penalties, as we saw in the shootout against Norwich. But I think there's a player there that can be developed into pretty much what Mourinho wants him to be. My gut feeling is that you could develop him into the next Sissoko type, albeit with probably more of an impact in that final third, which obviously we know Sissoko tries but doesn't have. I think that's something that certainly he's got to improve. His assists and goals scored haven't been great since he's made the step up to top flight football in Portugal. So I do wonder whether there's going to be more that kind of energetic engine room player who lays the ball on a kind of a plate for other players to do the job. So I think that's personally what I'd look to. I think he gives you width. He certainly is a willing runner, but then he has to learn to put the ball into the box and stuff like that. So, as I say, a bit of a blank canvas. So it's up to Mourinho really to make of him what he wants. Will Spurs pay the release clause? As with the Willian one, it's all about what they do on the pitch. I think you saw with Lo Celso, if you deliver the goods, that it just becomes a bit of a bargain. I think it's around 56 million, I would say, for Gedson, which kind of shows how highly both Benfica and Spurs rate him to agree to that deal. But I think it's going to have to be pretty spectacular to merit a 56 million, which is obviously an option rather than an obligation. Let's see what Mourinho does with him, really. If he turns him into an absolute Premier League star, then that could be a steal. But I would say, bearing in mind it was negotiated before everything that's happened in the last few months, I wouldn't be stunned if we see a bit of a Daniel Levy renegotiation coming up next season. But the good thing for Gedson is that he's essentially on a trial. You know, he's got 18 months to adapt, and even though he's been locked down, this kind of period would have been quite good for him just to get used to English culture and the weather, which we know is a bit weird. So let's see what he does. I personally think there's a bit of an uncut gem there, you know, that could be something if Mourinho deals with him in the right way. Paul Russell asks, with the free wingers we've been linked with, you don't think Spurs are thinking of selling Son, do you? I can answer that really quickly. No, absolutely not. I know he's, 27 or so now, but he's absolutely hitting his prime. He is not only such a terrific player, he's developed so much. I remember always whinging about the lack of consistency in his finishing and stuff like that. And I think he's addressed a lot of that. I think on a marketing, purely cynical value, I think he's a big name now. Obviously, we know he's often tagged with the Beckham of Asia tag that they put on him. But I think you'd be mad to let Sonny go. He's such a popular guy in the dressing room as well. I think Mourinho loves him. You saw how Spurs became even just, as he did before. He was scoring the goals while Kane was out. And I think you lose that kind of player who can step up for you. I think you're in big problems. No, essentially, in short. I hate Marmite. That actually is also my opinion. But that's the username here. Who is going to replace Jan Vertonghen? We have so many positions to fill. With Vertonghen, I think, looking at it, if you're looking at experienced centre-back, I think it's going to be Eric Dyer. I think Spurs will still bring in another central defender because I think they'll probably lose Juan Foyth. But I think in terms of that experienced Premier League adapted centre-back, that's what Eric Dyer, that's where he wants to play now. So you're now in a position that even if you lose Foyth, you've got Alderweireld, Sanchez, Dyer and Tanganga. That's four, very decent centre-backs. And I still I think there's a lot more to come from Davinson Sanchez. I think if you look at him in his first season, next couple of seasons haven't really matched that. And I'd hope that Mourinho can get something out of him and just unlock. I think there's a really terrific player in there. It's just about maybe using his head a little bit more, not so much in heading, but in terms of the decision-making and things like that. But, having seen how he performs against big teams, I think he'll be a big player. But I do still think maybe they'd look at one more defender just to bolster that. Because obviously Tanganga can also fill in at the fullback positions we now know. Anthony Lynch asks, any truth in Rakitic or Aarons coming to Spurs? My gut tells me Rakitic is just a bit of an easy link in terms of he's a player that we know Mourinho really likes. We've seen quotes from him in the past. And obviously, there's talk that he could be leaving Barcelona in the next window. I just wonder whether financially, in terms of the wages, whether he'd actually be in Tottenham's ballpark or not. And in that case, he's a guy that's in his kind of 30s, what is he, 32 now, maybe around that. I'd have to double check that. But I'd be surprised if they pay enormous wages for a guy of that age. Max Aarons, I think, is a more realistic prospect. He's obviously a guy that, you've heard me say before, Spurs have scouted him extensively, really like him. It's going to be a case of whether Norwich go down and what happens to that price tag around him. If he's an achievable price tag, I think it's very likely that Tottenham would make a move for him. But yeah, it's about also raising funds from players going out as well, and it obviously depends who that is, whether that's Carl Walker-Peters, whether that's Juan Foyth, as I've said, or anyone else. Rico Azusa sorry, that's my own handwriting. I might have absolutely mucked up your surname there. Who do you see becoming the next Spurs captain other than Lloris and Kane? Ooh, that's a good one, because obviously I think Kane is the natural heir if he sticks around for the long term. I think Harry Winks, if he finds himself a regular spot in the team, I think he's good academy product captain material. I think Eric Dyer, as I've just said, if he makes a central defensive role his own, is a possibility as well. This is the problem when looking past that kind of, looking into the future, it's all about how players develop and what happens next in their careers. So, yeah, I'd probably say Dyer and Winks are the two kind of main contenders for the role right now, unless I've forgotten anyone really obvious. You don't know how Dele Alli might develop. Dele Alli might develop into a leader. He's still only, 22, 23. He could become a leader. You just don't know which way they're going to go. Where else do we got here? We've got Cal W123 asks, players like Blaise Matuidi and Dries Martins are available for free. What's the likelihood of deals like that happening? Those two happening and joining Spurs for less money than they're on now? I think kind of probably answers within your own question there, really. I don't think players drop their wages to come to Tottenham, really. I just don't think it really works like that. Matuidi, I have a funny feeling that there was an option exercise to bump up his deal by a year. I think the club maybe did that, Juventus. I'd have to look into that, but I have a funny feeling I remember reading that. Dries Mertens seems to be very much a tussle between Inter and Chelsea for him, so I'd probably say no to either of those, I'm afraid. And he asked the second question, is there ever a buyback clause for young players who leave the club like Rio Griffiths, Keenan Bennett, Marcus Edwards? Not so much. It's more about sell-on fees. Like with Marcus Edwards, is a big old whacking 50% one when he went to Vitoria. There's not many. I mean, they had a first option on Bale, which expired last summer, to bring him back. So first option deals do kind of occur. They're probably not as regular in Premier League football as they are in maybe European football. Same with buyback clauses. So no, I'd imagine there's probably not on most of them. More sell-on ones for the future. Spurfect81 asks, do you think Levy and the board are already thinking of life after Jose Mourinho, as he often stays at clubs for only 2 to 3 years? And if so, who? Well, I think, it was quite heavily reported at the time, and certainly there was no denials that the likes of Julian Nagelsmann and Brendan Rodgers, I think, were both looked at very seriously, as well as Mourinho during that time. So obviously you're looking at two, especially one very young manager out in Germany, and one who is still relatively young, knows the Premier League well. I do wonder with Brendan Rodgers, he's one of those guys that you kind of think, he's obviously had his criticism people have made in the past, especially at Liverpool, but I've often thought actually for a Tottenham fit, he might actually work quite well. And we've seen what he's done at Leicester. It's kind of using the Tottenham model in a way, with the young talented players and getting them all working together with some older heads. I imagine they'd return for those two. With Nagelsmann, you don't know kind of where his career is going to go. He's an incredibly young, talented manager now. But unfortunately, like many managers, like say Eddie Howe's, he's a talented manager, but there's obviously questions about whether he stayed too long at Bournemouth and whether that's now his star has fallen because of that. So, yeah, whether Nagelsmann in 2 years' time will still have the same lustre, we don't know. Would I say they're planning right now for life after Jose? Probably not. I think now they've got him, is a manager Levy wanted for years. I think this is the third time Levy tried to get him, and he's obviously managed to get him. I think right now all they're thinking of the Mourinho era. NR asks, what are the chances of Spurs signing Zlatan Ibrahimovic? I'd probably say incredibly low. I think he's now, was he 39? Or he's going to be 39 if he's not already. He was kind of a bit part player as it was at Man U, really, towards the end of his time there. And yes, Mourinho's got that great relationship with him, being at Inter and Man U. And he's a very talented guy, obviously. Marketable presence as well. I just think with the wages it would involve and probably the lack of playing time he'd have, Yes, he's I think he's gone back to Italy now, isn't he, after the Galaxy spell? But the Premier League with the physicality and the pace, I wouldn't want to be kind of touching 40 and be trying to play that. We know Teddy did it, but it becomes so difficult, and I just can't see it. I just can't see it. And Mourinho pretty much dismissed it. I remember a few months back. It was January window, wasn't it? So, yeah, I can't see that happening, I'm afraid. Alex Stiliano asks, any chance we will move for Koulibaly and Samare? Koulibaly, if I remember correctly, I think there's a big whacking release clause on him, which they were looking for, which was around 60 million. And as I said, I can't see Spurs spending that kind of money. Certainly this year. Samare, obviously, there's a Lille link. João Sacramento, Mourinho's assistant head coach, will know him very well. He's not obviously quite a defensive midfielder. He's probably a bit of a hybrid between a Sissoko and Ndombele, is what, I haven't watched a lot of French football this season, but certainly people I've spoken to watch a lot of it have told me that's kind of what he's like. So he's not quite that defensive midfielder maybe Spurs need. He's certainly a very big and bright talent. It may be one like Bergwijn. If they feel that you can get him for a good deal, then you bring him in. But like I've said with Jedson, and what it means for Jedson Fernandez and what that would mean for Skip, Sissoko himself, I don't know. Talented young player though. It's definitely going to be one of this kind of next generation of French footballers coming through. Liam Burke asks, you've touched on the past on Spurs needing a central defensive midfielder. Actually, I just have. That's weird. And also players with experience. Who can you see fitting this role? Well, the one I've previously said I know people don't like because it doesn't show a lot of ambition, but I still feel that a really good fit for that role, for both, filling both elements, is Nemanja Matic. Yes, he's 31 now. United have taken up the option to take another year on his contract just to make sure he doesn't go for free. But I think if you're looking at a player you could probably get for relatively cheap, who knows Mourinho inside out, played with him at two different clubs, and also brings that winning mentality. The guy has won 2 Premier Leagues, hasn't he? 2 Premier League titles. I think for me, he fits the bill. Obviously he's not going to be incredibly mobile, but he's got enough fitness about him. He keeps himself ridiculously fit. And I just think Spurs lack winners and leaders, and I just think he would bring that to the role. So I'm sorry, it's not the sexy signing I think people would like to hear, but I think in a market where you're going to look for lower prices, I think it kind of fits the bill. Ian Shearer asks, do you watch highlights to reconnect with Spurs during this period? I don't so much, to be honest with you, which I really should, because my memory for certain matches is absolutely appalling. I've watched, obviously, when we had the anniversary of the Ajax victory, I've rewatched those. I had to interview Naeem a couple of weeks back, so I looked at a load of old stuff from his season. I watched a big old chunk of the 91 Cup final again. It's not really something I seek out, though. If I see something on Twitter, I'll probably watch it for a little bit. But yeah, I think that's why I kind of really loved watching Bundesliga football again today. Was just like watching live football. I think that's, bear in mind, it's just what I do for a living. I think that's what excites me more. What's happening now when you don't know what's about to happen. You don't know the ending of the story, as it were. So sorry about that. I don't particularly so much. I think I don't really need to reconnect with Spurs, I think, as well, because I'm still writing about them every day, pretty much every day. Lucas S asks, how is Luke Amos doing on loan? Does he have a future with Spurs? Luke Amos started like an absolute freight train at QPR. Had a really good start to the season. They were really, really pleased with him. And he got a really naff injury, which kept him out for months and really interrupted his season. He came back and he's a little bit in and out of the team. He's just had no luck with injuries. Obviously, he did his cruciate ligament, didn't he, about a month after making his Premier League debut under Poch. In terms of the future, I think Mourinho will have a look at him this summer. I think that's important. I think there'll be a few players that fall into that category. I think Mourinho hasn't had a chance to look at them, and when they come back, I say summer, whenever the next pre-season may be, I think he'll look at Amos. He definitely was a player that under Poch was almost there. He came on against Newcastle in the first game of that season after doing really well out in America. But I don't know. We'll see. Players develop so weirdly at that kind of age, that 2021, 22 kind of period. Sometimes you can see they're going to have a championship lower league career. Sometimes they just suddenly kick on. I mean, Harry Winks was a little bit like that. He just suddenly hit his stride in that pre-season out in Melbourne, Australia. I think he was 2021 then. So there's nothing stopping Amos. It just, for me, is how much the injuries have affected him, and then whether it's lowered his ceiling or not. George Wayne's asked, do you think we'll sign Iberici Easy? I still haven't worked out how to pronounce his name. Going back to QPR there again. A bit like Aaron's, he's a guy that Spurs have watched a lot. Really young attacking midfielder, talented young guy. My only worry with them going for him, two things. Price, as I've said a million times. If that's over a certain threshold, then they're not going to probably compete for him. Secondly, it depends on kind of the options in that position. Attacking midfielders, there's a lot of them right now at Spurs. It depends whether you look at him as a possibly converted almost striker. It depends what they kind of have plans for him long term with. But I think you've got so many attacking midfielders at Spurs right now. It's not really a priority. But like I said, it's one of those where maybe if they see him as a valuable asset that they can get more out of in the future, or he goes on to be a big star, then they'll go for it. They've got a great link up with QPR. Mark Warburton there. Pretty sure I remember him I think he was at Spurs very briefly, helping some of the under-18 coaches, unless I'm absolutely mixing him up. I think I'm mixing him up with the guy that went to Portsmouth. But that aside, they do have a good link up with him, and I think Warburton, there's some kind of connection with Spurs Academy, because obviously they've had Amos, they've got Clark now. I feel like they've had other players recently as well. But yeah, I think they'll look at that link, and again, it all comes down to money. I think with Tottenham, that's often the way. This next one. Jeff Stevens asks, any chance of us signing or taking Umtiti and Semedo from Barcelona on a swap deal for Ndombele, which has been mooted? From everything I'm hearing within Spurs, Mourinho's been quite impressed with Ndombele and the way he's knuckled down in training during lockdown and really improved his fitness. And certainly everything I'm hearing out of the club is they've got absolutely no intention of selling Ndombele or even loaning him out. There was that bizarre story linking him with a loan to Liverpool. So I'd say no on that. It sounds like they're very much going to look to try and get everything they can out of this guy. Let's not forget he's only 23, France international. Yeah, he's going to take a little bit of time to adapt, but it's worth the wait sometimes with players like that. To spend that sort of money, they'd have known what his character was like, and they would have known that or thought that they could change certain aspects of him to make him the finished product. I think there's a reason that enormous clubs, not saying Spurs aren't a big club, but clubs with ridiculous riches didn't go in for Ndombele seriously as well. And I think it was that little question mark over him. So for Spurs to get in there, I think they knew why he wasn't the finished article. And I think that'll all be about what Mourinho does now. And like I said, everything I'm hearing is that Mourinho believes he can be that game changer for Spurs. And he needs to keep working hard, which from everything I'm hearing is what he has been doing. Hugh Cassidy asks, why do you think Tottenham are disliked so much? We seem to be disliked by Arsenal and Chelsea and others. I think there's probably an element of every football club, you all think everyone kind of dislikes you. I think that's probably that kind of that complex as well. I think there's also probably an element of under Pochettino. I think a lot of people liked Pochettino, and I think there was a period where a lot of pundits and other clubs' fans quite liked what was happening at Spurs. There's kind of a young, talented team. I think that was a really good thing. And I think with Mourinho, as well as the silverware and his obvious successful CV, I think he also polarises opinions. And I think there obviously will be a lot of people that want him to fail. And I think that slightly transmits to Spurs as well. And I think that's probably what you're seeing in recent months. I think you're seeing people hoping, that Mourinho has slighted or haven't been impressed by Mourinho's things he's done in the past, and maybe that's what they're just waiting for, is him to trip up and Tottenham with him. I think it's a cyclical thing. I think sometimes clubs just go through these patches, where they're almost like everyone's second team. It's like, I do wonder whether, say, I think I've said this before, if Newcastle do their takeover and say Pochettino does go there, some Spurs fans might have a bit of a soft spot for Newcastle because Pochettino's there. I think I certainly, during the Bobby Robson years at Newcastle, I used to kind of keep a little eye on them. As a team, I kind of liked what he was doing there. And I just think, like I say, football goes in cycles. Brian Maguire asks, would you offer Michel Vorm a goalkeeper coaching role? It depends what he's going to do. It's an interesting one because obviously he was released last summer. Couldn't find another club, which surprised me. He was linked with various places, and I do imagine, maybe it was his expectation of the level he'd play at, perhaps. But I was quite surprised that he couldn't find another club. So obviously came back to Spurs when Lloris got injured. I think it's not pigeonholing, but suddenly deciding someone's right for a coaching role, it doesn't really quite work like that. I think it's more of you've seen it with Ryan Mason. I think these players they have to do their time, as it were. I think if he's going to maybe come into an academy kind of coaching role, perhaps, I'd imagine after this season he might not want to end it that way, that maybe he wants to just play one more season of regular football, whether that's back in the Netherlands, maybe playing at a slightly lower level if that's what he can get. It's quite sad for Michel Vorm in a way. I think he's been a good servant to Spurs. We know he's made mistakes, and he hasn't been the absolute top performing goalkeeper that he probably could have been, or maybe was back in his Swansea days. I think he's done a job, but I'd be surprised if there's any kind of first team coaching role. I think you're looking more at an academy thing, and possibly in the future. And the last question of the bunch, the 1912 asked, what are your thoughts on Dennis Serkin? Could we see him next season? There's been a real sudden flurry around Serkin in recent weeks. We had way back when Jose Mourinho saw him playing in the under-19s match. I'm trying to remember who it was against. I think it was Red Star. And he played really well. I've been very fortunate. I've seen a fair bit of Dennis Serkin. I think the reason I say a fair bit is because he hasn't actually played for the under-23s. I'm trying to think if he's actually played for them at all yet. That's the one I kind of watch more regularly, because the under-18s often it will clash with first team matches, so I don't get to see as much of them as I'd like. I try and get to the FA Youth Cup matches. I see all the under-19 European games and pretty much most of the home under-23 matches. So he hasn't actually done that middle stage yet. So personally, I'd be surprised if he's suddenly going to be flung into being a regular member of the first team. He's very young. He's only 17. It's a little bit like the Troy Parrott argument. Talented player. Really, I do believe he can go on to be a Tottenham first team player. I just think physically he needs to bulk up a little bit. He's a 17-year-old kid, and that's understandable. He's not going to have that physique yet. But I think he'll be one that they will start to involve. He was on the bench against Middlesbrough, wasn't it, in the FA Cup. Hasn't obviously appeared yet. I think whenever this pre-season may come, even maybe during the next little mini pre-season they have before the resumption of football, he might have opportunities to train with the team. But I just don't think, in terms of being ready straight away to be put into that left back slot, I'd be really surprised if it was straight away. Next season, maybe in things like the FA Cup, you'll start to see them coming through. But I think maybe people are getting slightly overexcited about the time and rushing the timeline for him. It's a process. It's what we see with these young players. It's important you don't. I know there's this thing about chucking them in. Look what Wayne Rooney did is kind of often the thing that's quoted, but not everyone. Everyone develops at different times, and I think you've got to do it at the right time. Otherwise, you can really kind of harm the development. And I think I hope that Spurs do that right with Dennis Sirkin, because he's a talented young kid. So that's that. Like I say, more questions I haven't used from the last video I will take, and I'll do them in another one coming up. And if you want to add your questions to the mix, leave them under this video, and I'll try and work my way through them next time. Hope this whiled away, 35 minutes or so of your day if you didn't have much else to do. And hopefully, I think it looks like we're going to have football back soon, barring anything absolutely disastrous happening in the coming weeks. I think it looks like we're now getting to that stage where it's going to happen. In what form and exactly how is going to be still to be defined, but I think it is. So we're going to get our football back, and hopefully, we'll start getting life back to some kind of normality as well in all other aspects of the world. So I'll catch you later. Stay safe and well, and I shall talk to you soon. Bye.